Well, it's great to be here. The last time I was at Francisco Marroquin was in 2016 with my wife, who also was giving some lectures at that time. And I believe I even was lecturing in this same hall. So it's wonderful to be back with another group of young students. I understand that you're here from a variety of different backgrounds in terms of fields, not just economics or business, but psychology, engineering, a variety of others. So I hope that this talk will be interesting without being really any technical economics in terms of the issues that the person I want to talk about was concerned with and their relevancy to our problems in the world today. So as you can see, I entitle this, Can Capitalism Survive? 80 years after Joseph Schumpeter's answer. In 1942, 80 years ago, Joseph Schumpeter, who is one of the most well-recognized and respected economists of the middle decades of the 20th century, wrote this book in the midst of the Second World War. And his conclusion, as I have here, can capitalism survive? No, I do not think it can. Capitalism stands its trial before judges who have the sentence of death in their pockets. They're going to pass it, whatever the defense they may hear. The only thing a successful defense can possibly produce is a change in the indictment and the charges of which capitalism is accused. That's rather pessimistic. So let's sort of understand Schumpeter and then his arguments and reasons for saying this and their relevance or application or applicability today. Schumpeter was born in 1883 in a part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now a part of the modern Czech Republic. He passed away in 1950 in his mid-60s, a relatively young man. He taught at several Austrian universities and briefly, shortly after the end of the First World War, served as the minister of the new Republic of Austria as Austria was starting to suffer from a great inflation like neighboring Germany. He was the head of a bank that went bankrupt during the inflationary period. And the stories are that he had to sort of sneak out of Vienna because the creditors of the bank were trying to get at him for somehow being the responsible person for the bankruptcy. He accepted a position at the University of Bonn in neighboring Germany. He taught there from 1919 until 1925 until 1932. He left Germany just before Hitler came to power, accepting a position at Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts, a position he held until his death in 1950. Now, Schumpeter's most famous works, which I've listed them here, I'll just mention a few of them, I tried to be thorough. The Theory of Economic Development, that's the book in which he developed his theory of the role and centrality of the entrepreneur in creative improvement of market systems. Then his second most famous studies are the sociology of imperialisms, social classes in an ethnically homogeneous environment. His next major work was a 2-volume book that he wrote called On Business Cycles in 1939. His hope was that it would be the rival of the recent book by John Maynard Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It failed in doing so. Keynes triumphed and Schumpeter did not. And then the book which I'm going to be focusing on, Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, published in 1942. And then finally, a book that he was working on when he died in 1950 was this huge, well over 1,000-page book on the history of economic ideas, which his wife finished in the sense of taking his unfinished chapters, the notes, putting them into sort of a more or less finished form as he left them. And that was published a few years after his death as The History of Economic Analysis, considered one of the great books in the history of economic thought. Now, Schumpeter saw the entrepreneur as the innovator who brings about transformative and positive change in the betterment of the human condition in a market economy. It takes many forms. This is actually a synthesized quote from it. The introduction of a new good, That is one which consumers are not yet familiar or of a new quality of a good. The introduction of a new method of production. That is one not yet tested by experience in the branch of manufacturing concerned. The opening of a new market. That is a market into which the particular branch of the manufacture of a country in question has not previously entered. The conquest of a new source of supply of raw materials or half-manufactured goods. And the carrying out of a new organization of any industry, like the creation of a monopoly position or the breaking up of a monopoly position. So in Shumpeter's theory, what brings about change, the type of transformative change of the railway, the telephone, the airplane, the automobile, the computer, the development of the ability to control the atmosphere with air conditioning and heating systems. All the things that we take for granted in our society at some point began with some person's idea and their willingness or partnering with others who were willing to undertake the innovative application of them, putting up capital, either their own or those who they borrowed from or they got to partner with them, to undertake the risk and uncertainty of beginning a production process, bringing the product to market, and then hopefully, if it's a product that the consumers actually want and are willing to pay for, might generate a revenue greater than the costs of doing so, and therefore earn this innovative entrepreneurial profit. But Shumpeter's point was that the very innovative successes of an entrepreneur, the profits he earns by marketing the new product, the better product, the less costly product, will in time generate new rivals to enter his corner of the market. And his very success will generate the rivals who will compete away his profits as they too adapt and modify and improve his own innovative ideas. So the entrepreneur is the crucial element in the market economy. For him, all the improvements in our standards of living, our qualities of living over the last, let's say, 200 years are due to the extent to which markets have been free, open to the entrepreneur who is willing to develop a new idea, incur the risk of making a loss instead of a profit, and can combine the resources under his directing leadership to bring that product eventually before the consuming public. Now, he also argued that for those of you who have taken maybe some economics, it's very common in our economics textbooks to have sort of a juxtaposing of what's called a perfect competition model and a monopoly model. And Shumpeter considered that these are two irrelevant ways of thinking about the market. They're frozen pictures in time of a particular situation where there are multitudes of competitors or only one competitor, the monopoly position, but no understanding of how do these situations arise? What changes them over time? And so he considered the textbook understandings of competition and monopoly were irrelevant and misplaced. Instead, you had to think of the market as a dynamic process through time. He called it the perennial gale of creative destruction. It's a famous phrase that he coined that has become almost a cliche in understanding the dynamism of enterprise innovation. In dealing with capitalism, we are dealing with an evolutionary process. It revolutionizes the economic structure from within. It incessantly is destroying the old one, creating a new one. This process of this creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. The fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumer good, the new method of production and transportation, the new markets, new form of industrial organization that capitalist enterprise creates. It is to be distinguished from the textbook models. It is hardly necessary to point out that competition of this kind we now have in mind acts not only when in being, but also when it is merely ever present. Because anyone who comes up with a new idea must keep in mind that if he's successful, that very success will draw rivals to try to copy him and improve on him and compete away the profits that were the incentive for him to try the process to begin with. And he therefore said if capitalism was to be judged, its successes, its staying power, its improvements and betterments and goodness for the society, you have to look at it as a process through time, not a particular moment or even a week or a year, but your judgment had to take the long sweep of history, competition in this dynamic way over years, even decades. And when you take that longer run view, you see that if we want a prosperous as well as a free society, there is no substitute for this open, competitive capitalist system. Now, he said that this was made possible, and in fact reinforced the liberal ideals of a free society. Before 1914, that is, before the First World War, under capitalism, when the world was rapidly internationalizing itself, everybody talks about globalization today. It's not always remembered that before the First World War, the world was heavily globalized already. There was a global division of labor, a global investment of capital, movement of peoples. Before the First World War, most leading countries of the world had no passport or visa requirements. You resettled, you went to work, you visited, you stayed, you left, with no restrictions. That's how my grandparents came from Europe to the United States in the years before the First World War. No passports and no visas. The freedom of movement matching the freedom of goods and the freedom of investable capital. Free movement of commodities, restricted if at all only by customs tariffs, freedom in unquestioned principle of migration of people and of capital, all this facilitated by unrestricted gold currencies. At home, practically all civilized countries professed an allegiance to the democratic ideal. The freedom of the individual to say, think, and do what he pleased was also within very wide limits generally accepted. This freedom included the freedom of economic action. Private property, inheritance, free initiative, and conduct were essential elements of that capitalist civilization. And in 1946, Shumpeter contributed a new article on capitalism for the Encyclopedia Britannica. The familiar features of capitalism and its political complement, liberalism, were laissez-faire, in particular free trade and sound money, meaning unrestricted gold currency, a pacific, though far from a pacifist attitude towards foreign nations, unprecedented respect for personal freedom, not only in economic but in all matters, the principle of leaving individuals to themselves and of trusting their free interaction to produce socially desirable results. That is amazing. That is amazing. It has given us all the freedoms and prosperities and betterments that we take for granted this last 200 years. To the extent that markets have been free, individuals have been at liberty to choose and act and freely associate and trade and exchange and invest and produce. It is the residue elements of this competitive system that has given us the world that we enjoy and just presume somehow it's here. But in the book, Shumpeter emphasizes his pessimism, his concern, his doubts. Why did he think capitalism wasn't going to survive? Primarily two reasons. He argued that the spirit of individualist capitalism was being replaced by a sort of faceless and bureaucratic corporate structure that submerged, seemed to remove the creative individual, the leader who sort of conjures up the entire process and guides it himself. Now it's sort of the corporate bureaucracy that easily ends up working hand in hand with the growing government bureaucracy that narrows, confines, straitjackets the market through regulations, controls, and various forms of planning through government-business partnerships. But I would argue that as much as he had these concerns, the far more important concern that Shumpeter had is the rise and domination of capitalist society by an anti-capitalist intellectual class. He called these sort of a second-handers and second dealers in ideas. They know little or nothing about the real world of business, enterprise, commerce. They've gone to the university, they've had their heads filled with ideas of critiques and criticisms and notions of injustice about business and enterprise and the profit motive. And with this alternative, usually socialist type vision, they end up opposing, criticizing, disliking, challenging, and calling for the end of the capitalist system. And they presume and assume to know enough to assert how a better world could be created if they were the political paternalists, if they were the social engineers put in charge, either actually in charge as the bureaucrats, the social managers, or the advisors to the government, who would whisper in the ear of those in power and tell them what to do. This is sort of a capsulization of the passage and chapter in which he talks about this. The man who has gone through college or university easily enters the intellectual class in a thoroughly discontented frame of mind. Discontent breeds resentment, and it often rationalizes itself into the social criticism, which is the intellectual spectator's typical attitude towards men, classes, and institutions. The role of the intellectual group consists primarily in stimulating, energizing, verbalizing, and organizing this material of anti-capitalist sentiments and resentments. The intellectual group cannot help nibbling at the foundations of capitalist society because it lives on criticism. And its whole position depends on criticism that stings. And this hostility increases instead of diminishing with every achievement of the capitalist evolution. So the more capitalism achieves, the more angry and vocal and resentful the intellectuals become of it. Intellectuals rarely enter professional politics and still more rarely conquer responsible office, but they staff political bureaus with party pamphlets and speeches, act as secretaries and advisors, make the individual politician's newspaper reputation, which, though it is not everything, few men can afford to neglect. In doing these things, they come to some extent impress their mentality on almost everything that is being done. We all are dependent upon these intellectuals. How much do we know about each other's disciplines, fields, the social issues, the histories, the events going on in our community, our society, the world? We rely upon these specialists in ideas to tell us what's going on, why it's happening, what does it mean, and what can be done. And Shumpeter's point is the people who do this second-handing in ideas, who become the conveyors between ideas and events and us, the intermediary, they do so through a certain way of looking at the world, a pair of glasses that is inherently, basically, and almost inescapably anti-capitalist in his view. The problem is, he then says, but why wouldn't we expect then that the ordinary people who are benefiting from the new goods, the better goods, the less expensive goods, the greater variety of improved qualities of goods, the greater employment opportunities and the rising standards of living and wages as business expands with more enterprises, more businessmen needing hands to work for them. Why wouldn't the average person look beyond and outside of what the intellectuals are saying and just look around their own life, the reality in which they're living, and seeing year after year things get better? Shumpeter says that is difficult for the average person. Basically because the case for capitalism, he argues, requires the individual to take that long-run view, that dynamic conception of capitalism, not the ups and downs, the profits and losses, the creation of a new job, industrial changes that eliminate a particular job here. You have to look beyond that to the long process of how all of these squiggles and ups and downs cumulatively are raising the standards and qualities of life of all the people in the society in that longer run perspective. The case for capitalism could never be made simple. People at large would have to be possessed of an insight and a power of analysis which is altogether beyond them. Why practically every nonsense that has ever been said about capitalism has been championed by some professed economists. But even if this is disregarded, rational recognition of the economic performance of capitalism and of the hopes it holds out for the future would require an almost impossible moral feat by the have-not. That performance stands out only if we take a long-run view. Any pro-capitalist argument must rest on long-run consideration. In order to identify himself with the capitalist system, the unemployed of today would have to completely forget his personal fate, and the politician of today, his personal ambition. For the masses, it is the short-run view that counts. Like Louis XV, they feel après nous déluge, after us the flood. Secular improvement that is taken for granted and coupled with individual insecurity that is acutely resented, is of course the best recipe for breeding social unrest. I often find this when I give talks, because most people have never taken an economics class. And I don't hold you responsible or guilty for not taking an economics class. There's a division of labor, and people specialize in different things. And sometimes you may end up taking a major or a field in which economics courses are part of the curriculum or not. Or your time might be too busy, even though you are a citizen, you're a voter, you're a member of the society, and might think to be informed a little bit. But the pressures of time, the cost of reading an economics book compared to spending time on the job or your business or your family or your friends or other obligations may be too great. So people often don't know about these things. But because they don't, they often have a misunderstanding. How many times in my country do I hear people saying, people do not earn a living wage? Why doesn't government either establish or raise the legal minimum wage below which no businessman can employ and pay a worker? Wouldn't that improve everybody's economic situation? Give them a decent living wage, those greedy businessmen. What people have a hard time focusing on is just reflecting on their own circumstances in the marketplace. You buy something. If the price starts going up, at some point you ask yourself, is it still worth it? Can I afford to buy as much of it? And you economize, you cut back, you reduce the amount you buy. We all know that commonsensically. Why would we expect it no different than from the businessman? He has no money to pay wages other than what he earns as revenue from selling us, the consumers, some product in the market. If the government raises the wages, then he may have to decide that given what he thinks he can make and the price he can charge and the revenue he can earn, some of these workers now are too expensive to hire. He can't afford it. Their cost is greater than the revenue benefit of what they can help him do. So he will let some go and therefore employ fewer people. Or there are some positions he was thinking of adding which will never be made available. And some people therefore may be locked out of the job market and as a result have no employment. And a zero wage with being unemployed is much lower than a market established raise, whatever it might be. For the unskilled, the person who hasn't finished high school, how can they gain the skills, the knowledge, the workplace experience that over time may make them more valuable to an employer? If they don't get an entry-level job at even a low wage reflecting what they're worth, unskilled and untrained, but over time can improve their value to that employer or some other so that their wage and their employment opportunities can improve over time. You lock them out of the market. You have to look beyond the immediate to what are the longer run consequences. You're at an institution that sometimes refers to that Frenchman Frédéric Bastiat, French economist of the early 19th century. He made the distinction between what is seen and what is unseen. What is seen is, oh, the government does a good thing. It raises the wage. Does not make you feel good. What is unseen is the loss of jobs that might result when the higher wage results in pricing out of the market some people beyond what an employer thinks they are worth. That is what Shumpeter is talking about. So what can we say about this? Looking at when Shumpeter wrote this in 1942, this was the high watermark of the socialist movement, if you will. There was the Soviet Union. It's the middle of the Second World War. Is not the Soviet Union the ally with Britain and America fighting the Nazis? Is that the powerhouse of the example of a centrally planned economy? Wasn't there the Great Depression of the 1930s in the capitalist countries? Surely in the post-war years, we too must have forms of planning. It may be dictatorial, like the Soviet Union under Stalin, or maybe we can make it democratic socialism, but planning, we need planning. Guided by this socialist critique of capitalism. And that's what he was despondent about. Now, was he correct? In this sense, he was not correct. The fact is, socialism did not triumph around the world. Socialism did not triumph around the world. Has government regulation grown and been extended over more activities of private enterprise? Yes. Have taxes increased? Yes. Does the government redistribute wealth more through the tax and regulatory system? Yes. But at another level, in spite of being impeded and handicapped and straitjacketed, the fundamental institutions of the market have been able to basically survive. Private property, degrees of competitive supply and demand, opportunities for new entrepreneurs and innovators to rise up, even in corporate structures. Just think about this. We all carry this around. It seems like something we've had forever. This is less than 15 years old. The smartphone is only 15 years old, right? Steve Jobs, Apple. Okay? Steve Jobs was Shumpeter's type of entrepreneur. Imagine holding something in one hand that is designed so you can push all the buttons just with your thumb. He had his engineers plan it that way. He wasn't an engineer. So I wanted to do that. I have this vision. Imagine that it doesn't just work as a phone, but you can send text messages, emails. You can listen to music, watch movies, live streaming, download books. I have an iLibrary here of hundreds of books. I can go anywhere and I have my personal library. I can read the newspapers. I don't have to go to the corner store and buy a newspaper. So in that sense, we've continued to have the transformative nature of capitalism, just epitomized by this thing, which now was so innovative and creative that, was there a world before this? There was. And it's due to a handful of people like Steve Jobs. And during these 80 years since the book was written, we therefore have experienced continuing improvements in our standards of living. Let me give you a point of comparison. If we could go back 200 years to around 1820, what we would see is a world that had a world population, a global population of 1 billion people. Economic historians, population demographers, they estimate that in 1820, out of that 1 billion people, 90% lived in abject poverty. You know, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Are you going to have a roof over your head? Fast forward to 2019, just before the COVID nonsense occurred and caused all these problems, right? 2019, 200 years later. What is the world's population? 7.7 billion instead of 1. And out of that 7.7 billion, demographers, statisticians, economic historians, in the sort of the UN released documents that studying global trends, less than 10% lived in poverty in 2019. Out of the larger 7-fold increase in poverty. How was that made possible? 7 times more people, from 1 to 7, over 7 billion people, and instead of 90% in poverty, only 10%? That is capitalism. And you all take it for granted. And if COVID hadn't gotten in the way, and if a lot of other nonsense that seems to be going on now was not getting in the way, that proportion of the population living in poverty would have become only 8% of the global population, 5%. And finally, it is imaginable by the end of the 21st century, your century, poverty might be gone. The dream of humanity, no poverty, could be ours, certainly yours. I'm older than you, but you or your children will see the end of this century. That would be amazing if the entrepreneur in capitalism was left free enough. But the greatest difficulty, Shumpeter was saying, is that the intellectual anger and criticism and dislike for capitalism remains just as present and as intense today as when he wrote that book 80 years ago. But instead of socialism and class conflict, as in the old Marxian sense, what we see now is a new variation of it. Remember that quote, okay, at the beginning. Capitalism, he said, is being judged by critics who hold its death warrant in their pocket. The best that a defense attorney can do is change the indictment, the reasons why capitalism will be condemned to death. Nobody believes in that old Marxian class conflict stuff anymore. That's passé. So instead, what do the critics of capitalism talk about? A different type of anti-capitalist argument, set of them. Political correctness. Oh, we all hear that term, either in English or whatever, I suppose the Spanish version of it is. What is this? It is a totalitarian ideology of permitted words and actions. Oh, you're using the wrong pronoun. Oh, you can't say that word. Oh, no, you can't interact and associate in this way. We set a benchmark, a standard, which you will be judged by and condemned by if you don't use these words, this rhetoric, act and associate in these ways with people, because we know what is right in language and deed. Identity politics. I have no idea how far this has gotten here, but in places like the United States and a growing part of Europe, this is the new race-based tribal collectivism. You know, the American Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and at that time when they used men, they meant everybody. All men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That is, you got them, and the government doesn't give them to you, and they should be recognized as not to be ever taken away from you. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments are formed among men to secure those rights and not to violate them. That sense of a society based on the rights of the individual, the freedom of the individual, the identity of the individual, that the individual identifies and defines himself. He decides how he views himself, who he wants to associate with, his dreams, his hopes, his desires, as long as he does it peacefully and honestly in the free associations of an open society. They oppose that. You are white, you are black, you are Hispanic, you are Asian, you are male, you are female, or 27 genders in between. I don't even know how you keep that straight in your head. I'm really confused. Humanity goes through how long have human-like creatures been on this planet? Maybe about 200,000 years, I guess, maybe more. And for all of that time, we assumed, how stupid of us, there were men and women. Thank goodness in the last 10 years, we've found out that's not the case. What? How did we survive for all those hundreds of years, thousands of years? My God. Anyway, I'm so glad this handful of people told me that I don't know what I am. You think I'm exaggerating? The President of the United States, Joe Biden, nominated a black woman to be on the Supreme Court of the United States, right? Our high Supreme Court, the first black woman. So you have to go through a hearing from the United States Senate to confirm your nomination. You know, the Senate approves it, and then you're on the Supreme Court. So one of the senators at this hearing asked her, could you please define for me what is a woman? To which she replied, I'm not a biologist. So Joe Biden has nominated you to be the first black woman on the Supreme Court, but you don't know yourself what a woman is. Does that not, am I the only one who thinks that's bizarre? Anyway, but this now defines you. What your income will be, what type of employments you'll receive, what your status and position in the society will be. Your successes, your opportunities are not based upon a wide area of your own abilities and dreams and hopes and drives and determination and tries. No, your future will be dictated by the group to which you've been classified, and in the political process of the pull and pressures of pressure group politics in governments and political parties, that'll determine your fate, your future, your opportunities. You as an individual disappear in the tribal collective that they have assigned to you. That is what is threatening. Cancel culture, suppression of all opposing views and ideas by erasing them from history and contemporary society. I don't know what goes on here. In America, they tear down statues. They erase people from books. They condemn people and drive them out of their jobs. Why? Because they might have said something or done something when they were a teenager or even younger. Oh, a sexist. Oh, a racist. Or you didn't do anything, but they've decided that your views suggest that you would have done something if you had done it. People's lives and careers have been destroyed. History has been erased. You know, in the old Soviet Union under Stalin, he would carry out these purges. And if he purged you, right, you're killed, you're sent to a labor camp, he would then have books with your picture in it, airbrushed out. So you'd be in a picture with Stalin, and you disappear in the next edition of the book. You're gone. That's cancel culture. Erase the past. You don't like the past, you criticize the past, you judge the past, it's gone. History then has no meaning. History doesn't speak to you. An elite of ideological dogmatists determine what you will know history because they've determined what will be in the history books and in the monuments of the society. Just a couple more. The Green New Deal. That's a phrase in the United States. Again, I assume there's some version of the environmentalist movement here in Guatemala. But if you read these people, particularly they're in some type of euphoria in America. Oh, the world is coming to an end because of climate change. We have only 12 years to exist. 15 years ago, they were saying 12 years. It seems to be a moving 12 years. A moving 12 years. But it's not enough that the climate might be changing. What are we to do about it? Oh, there's only one answer. Government planning, government control, government prohibition, government dictating what to produce, how to work, what to buy, where to live. It's the old socialist central planning model in the name of saving the planet. Your destiny is determined by how they think you fit in as a little nothing in the grand scheme of planning the planet to save the world. And finally, pandemic authoritarianism, the command and control of everyday life in the name of fighting a virus. 2 years ago, who thought that the government would tell entire countries, stop working, stop producing, stay home, don't go out, only shop for what we decide you need as essentials, wear a mask, don't get too close. Central planning and dictating to bring societies to a halt in the name of keeping people apart. And the degree to which all of us have just passively accepted, well, they say it's the science. The science. And if the politicians and the bureaucrats say it's the science, who are we to disagree? This has set a precedent that every time there seems to be a new national crisis, a new medical emergency, well, we did it then. That's the benchmark, and to do it again and again and again. And we become passive little obedient servants to do as they tell us. Don't go to work. Don't go shopping. Only buy this. Wear the mask. These are the new forms of the intellectuals' attempt to destroy the free market and free society of which Shumpeter was concerned. Now, did that make him a pessimist? Okay? Did that make him a pessimist? Is this inevitable? And I sort of want to end with no. He was often called a defeatist. Oh, capitalism is ending. These are uncontrollable and unstoppable forces. But Shumpeter didn't believe that. He believed that he was making an objective statement as what he thought the trends in society were. You don't kill the messenger merely because you don't like the message. It's your response to the message that dictates what happens. As he said, facts in themselves and inferences from them can never be defeatist, or the opposite, whatever that might be. The report that a given ship is sinking is not defeatist. Only the spirit in which this report is received can be defeatist. The crew can sit down and drink, but it can also rush to the pumps. That is, try to keep it afloat, do the repairs before it sinks, and try to reinforce it so it's better than before. If the men merely deny the report, though it be carefully substantiated, then they are escapists. What normal man will refuse to defend his life merely because he is quite convinced that sooner or later he will have to die anyhow? Frank presentation of ominous facts was never more necessary than it is today, because we seem to have developed escapism into a system of thought. Shumpeter was saying it doesn't have to be this way. Now, Shumpeter went to the University of Vienna before the First World War. And one of his fellow students in graduate school was an Austrian economist whose name you might have heard at Francisco Marroquin, Ludwig von Mises. And Mises once wrote an article called Trends Can Change. And in this article he said, yes, many times it seems that trends are inescapable, unstoppable, inevitable. But if you take the long sweep of history, you realize what seemed like an unstoppable, inevitable, and inescapable trend changed. This trend can change, but it requires the power of ideas, the willingness to articulate them, and to defend them in our various ways and of walks of life. The kind of ideas that you learn here at Francisco Marroquin. The ideas of the freedom of the individual, the dignity of the individual, the rights of the individual, the opportunities of market-free exchange that you learn here at Francisco Marroquin. Those are the institutional principles and ideals that make a free and a prosperous society. They're the only ideas that can hold this back. But that is up to you. You can make the difference. If you do, you will man the pumps, the ship will be kept afloat, better, good ideas will improve the existing system, and freedom and prosperity will prevail for you and your children. Thank you very much.